Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. First hour today, we're going to pull together two different topics that we address so often here on Point of View: the millennial generation and education. And if you've been receiving my commentaries, I've been writing them for many years, but about 5 years ago, I looked it up. I began to quote from this book, The Dumbest Generation. The book had come into my hands. I found it in a bookstore, began to see, you know, this is really addressing some very important issues about the loss of any kind of cultural literacy, the impact that these digital devices are having on this generation. And so certainly we have over the years had a chance to have some pretty good conversations about that book. The author is Mark Bauerlein, and he is also the editor of a new book out, The State of the American Mind, 16 Leading Critics on the New Anti-Intellectualism. Some of those contributors are people that we've had on the program, people like Dennis Prager and Daniel Dreisbach and others. So I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation as we kind of look at this issue in a broader context and really begin to understand what is happening in this generation, how to reach them, and some very real concerns about what is happening today to the American mind. Mark Bauerlein has his PhD in English from UCLA. He has been at Emory University for many years and is also the senior editor at First Things magazine, author of a number of books. And Dr. Bauerlein, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I'm glad to join you.
I guess we need to probably talk about a couple of books that precede this that are very important. I remember one of the endorsements on your book, The Dumbest Generation, was by Alan Bloom, and that is The Closing of the American Mind. And that book, in some respects, is very important, and I see you quote it early on in the book, because if you go back to, I guess, 1987 when it first came out, it was saying there's something very wrong about American education, and that is one thing that every professor can assume when he walks into a classroom, and every student can assume when he or she walks into a classroom, is that the students believe in relativism. And that was quite an earth-shaking book, wasn't it?
It was, and it struck a chord because Bloom was a very intelligent and cosmopolitan professor of European thought and history at University of Chicago. This is very highbrow stuff. He writes this book, The Closing of the American Mind, and it goes crazy on the bestseller lists. People bought it. It spent 6 months up there. And he was on TV shows. Everyone was discussing it. It became a very important salvo in the culture wars of the times. But it showed that he caught on to something, and that is that really he focused on the college campus and said that the college campus is no longer a place for free inquiry and liberal education and immersing yourself in the great books, great works of art, great ideas. No, it had become a place for a kind of extension of high school. There were social activities were prevailing over intellectual ones, and identity politics and mass culture, popular culture, were invading. And that he worried that this is going to have reverberate through the wider culture, and he was right. This is where we are today. He talked about political correctness back in 1987.
Yes.
And political correctness today on campus is a lot worse. Professors and administrators and other students walk around in fear today. Fear of saying the wrong thing, of making a joke, of getting caught on camera, doing something stupid. We all do stupid things. and it can become for an adult, it can ruin your career. For a student, it can get you expelled, and it's a place where the free marketplace of ideas has again turned into this cautionary, sensitive, hypersensitive environment.
Well, and again, if the book came out now, I think a lot of people would say, well, tell me something I don't know. But back in 1987, it was prophetic in a very sad way, because it tells us a little bit about the state of the American mind, if I can borrow the title of your book. And one of the other books that I thought would be good to put on the table, because I recognize many of my listeners are younger than I am, would be a book by Edie Hirsch, who actually wrote the introduction on cultural literacy. And again, for people who don't know, that book, Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know, when it came out, it also struck a chord, because there were a lot of people saying, yeah, see, that's what education needs to be. There's certain facts that I think every student graduating from high school should know. And, of course, the Academy criticized it a great deal. And you would still think, as he points out in this introductory chapter for your book, that even if not all of the academic world accepted it, certainly there would have been some enterprising publisher that might say, well, why don't we develop a curriculum along these lines and just see whether or not some of these school boards would actually accept it. But the sad reality is that never happened either.
Well, Hirsch's idea was to identify that body of knowledge that everyone really needs to know in order to do well in particularly white-collar professional zones and in college as well. And the goal for Hirsch was not to maintain an elite culture and an elite population. It was actually to give disadvantaged students the tools to rise on the income ladder, to succeed. Class mobility. Hirsch is a progressive Democrat. Mm-hmm. Bloom was a cultural conservative. But Hirsch's idea was that if we don't give disadvantaged, poor, urban, children with single mothers, those who are growing up in tough circumstances, if we don't give them the intellectual tools, all the way down, starting in elementary school, they're going to hit college and they're going to flounder, because those college teachers, they're just going to drop an allusion to the French Revolution. If you've never heard of that before, if you don't know anything about it, well, you're going to feel inferior. You're going to feel left behind, and a lot of those students drop out. But the problem for Hirsch was that when he identified the contents that you need to know in order to read the New York Times, it was just too darn white, male, Eurocentric, and Judeo-Christian for the educators, and they denounced it. They called him some kind of right-wing conservative, elitist snob. And Hirsch was saying, well, who are you talking about? That's not me.
I'm one of you guys. I could be writing for the New York Times. Yeah, go ahead.
They kept his works out of the ed schools. They when the states and the federal government formed groups and education groups to develop education standards, Hirsch was not invited to be part of that. It just looked too much. It just lacked the sufficient bean counting diversity.
Wow.
And it's a terrible shame, because he is right on the cognitive, scientific grounds. He's absolutely right. If you do not know the King James Bible, if you don't know the Sermon on the Mount deeply, how much are you going to miss in American political rhetoric of the last 250 years?
Quite a bit. Let me take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about functional illiteracy, cultural illiteracy, biblical illiteracy, not to mention moral illiteracy. Lots to cover. We'll come back right after these important messages.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Words have meaning, sometimes especially in a landmark court case dealing with the legalization of same-sex marriage. Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for the majority of the Supreme Court, acknowledged that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that by divine precepts, same-sex marriage should be condoned. In his opinion, he pointed to the First Amendment that ensures that religious organizations and persons be given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths. But the opinion rarely talks about the free exercise of religion or even the establishment of a state religion. In his dissent, Justice Clarence Thomas seemed disturbed by the way Justice Kennedy framed the issues. He said the majority appears unmoved by that inevitability. It makes only a weak gesture towards religious liberty in a single paragraph. He goes on to say that even that gesture indicates a misunderstanding of religious liberty in our nation's tradition. Religious liberty is about more than just the protection for religious organizations and persons as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faith. Justice John Roberts focused on the words that were used and the word that wasn't. He says the majority graciously suggested that religious believers may continue to advocate and teach their views of marriage. The First Amendment guarantees, however, the freedom to exercise religion. Ominously, that is not the word that the majority uses. I believe the way Justice Kennedy framed this majority opinion should be a concern. One guest on my radio program suggested this section of the opinion might be just poorly worded. That may be true, but I doubt it. This majority opinion seems to be saying that you can advocate for traditional marriage, but you can't exercise your religion based upon that belief. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about a number of things, not only functional illiteracy, but cultural illiteracy and even biblical literacy. We'll get into all those various topics as we talk about this new book, The State of the American Mind, 16 Critics on the New Anti-Intellectualism. Mark Bauerlein with us. And let's, if we can, maybe talk about your chapter, The Troubling Trend of Cultural IQ, because on the one hand, we see one trend that we've been hearing about for decades, really. That is that IQ seems to be going up, but I think it has more to do with your capacity for abstraction. But you can talk about that in just a minute. But on the other hand, SAT scores have continued to drop. Where are we in terms of just what young people today know, or even older people know, about some of the basic facts and how they're doing intellectually?
Well, when we look at some of the national achievement levels for college-age students, we find SAT reading scores are at their lowest point in 50 years. The NAEP reading scores for 12th graders, that's the nation's report card that is often used to gauge how states are doing. The NAEP reading scores, they're stalled. They're the same place they were in the early 70s, in spite of all the money that has poured in and all the legislation directly focused upon reading. When we look at SAT writing scores, SAT added a writing component in 2005. Scores have gone down every year except 2 years when they were flat. When we look at college admissions, everyone's trying to go to college now. They're focused on college readiness now in high school. Remediation keeps going up. Remediation is when students get admitted to a college. They've graduated from high school. They then take a diagnostic test in reading and math and writing, and they then find themselves assigned to a remedial course because they don't have the skills yet to do college work. About 40% of students now are having to go into some remediation of some kind. It's a huge expense for colleges. Now, when we look at how colleges are doing educating people, we have a great essay by Richard Arum to show that we've got limited learning, as he calls it, going on in college. We have barely a bump in critical thinking skills. That's what he focused upon in his work from freshman year to senior year. And that's after sometimes $200,000 of tuition that people have paid. Now, the people also, as you mentioned, people point to the IQ scores going up, and they have during the 20th century. They've gone up significantly. But when you break the IQ down into all the subtests, IQ is actually a composite of all these different areas. On those very abstract ones, whereby you'll get these shapes, 3 shapes in a row, and then you have to pick the 4th shape. So you're looking at some kind of pattern recognition, some hypothetical relationship. We're doing much better on those things, and that's just because we're practicing that in schools. But when we do arithmetic, arithmetic has gone up microscopically. Reading or vocabulary has gone up for adults pretty well, and that's due to the increased college enrollments. For children, reading vocabulary has gone up hardly a bit. So when we get down to basic abilities, basic skills, we're not doing much better than we used to.
Right, it's just incredible.
And those are the most important, those are the most practical ones, the most active ones out there in the real world.
Let me add a disclaimer, because I know that when I've talked with you, or else when I've oftentimes just read some of my commentaries or we've interacted, especially when your book, The Dumbest Generation, came out, I would sometimes have people calling in and saying, you're being awful mean to these millennial students. It's not their fault. And you know what? I will partially say it's not. Partially, it's not their fault. Now, when they choose to spend hours in front of a video screen instead of doing their homework, okay, I think that part's their fault. But if we are not doing a good job in the educational product that we are producing out of high school, you have to begin to, as you say, wonder about the kind of time and energy and financial resources we spend, and then the fact that our students, when compared to students around the world, sometimes who come from relatively disadvantaged nations, our students do poorly on almost every one of the tests except self-esteem. They always feel real good about it, even though they do really poorly on most of these international tests. Am I true? Fair on that?
That's right. That's right. I mean, we're in the bottom half now of developed nations when it comes to ability, academic ability. But we're at the very top, and whether we think we're good at it or not. Now, we've got a good entry by Jean Twenge here, who writes about college students. In 1966, when they asked college students, where would you place yourself in terms of academic ability relative to your peers? Above average, average, below average. 39% called themselves above average. Now, that's more than a third, but not by much. We'll say there's a little exaggeration going on there. Today, 71% believe themselves above average in academic ability, which is, of course, statistically impossible. Now, it's our fault. You're exactly right. In 1960, 15% of the grades in college given were A's. C was the most common grade. Today, A at 43% is by far the most common grade given. Now, not only that, but more than half of the students who leave high school and go to college graduate with an A average. So we are actually giving higher and higher grades. We're telling students, we're telling young people that they're great. This is why when they're in my class, I teach at a selective university, at Emory University in Atlanta. They're bright, they're motivated, but they bear a lot of the traits of youth culture that have to be expelled. I get them a few months out of high school, and one of the things I say by the end of the first week is, now listen, all of you, we've had discussion. You need to know, if you put a like in every sentence, no one is ever going to take you seriously.
Yes.
Now, the first time I say that, I can tell they haven't been told this ever before.
Isn't that amazing?
They don't want to. They don't want to be stupid. But no one has let them know, you can't talk this way. I mean, much less say, you can't use the F word in public. Okay?
Yeah.
You have to behave in a decent fashion. I mean, we can get into that, the deterioration of public mores and manners. But they haven't been told.
It's just incredible. This is all part of the book, The State of the American Mind, and we'll get back in just a minute after the break and maybe talk about biblical literacy. Daniel Dreisbach wrote about that, and there are some things about why Johnny and Joni can't write revisited, as well as some others. And we mentioned Jean Twain just a minute ago. We talked about her work on narcissism and the rest, rise of the self and the decline of intellectual and civic interest, as well as a couple of other things that relate to the national consequences. Nicholas Eberstadt's been with us before, as we talked about, in this case, American exceptionalism. And, of course, we mentioned Dennis Prager earlier. We live in the age of feelings. You know, we have the Reformation and the Renaissance, and then we have, Mark, the age of feelings that we find ourselves in right now. So a lot of great material. Let's take a break, but when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls. Perhaps you have some comments today about what we've already covered, and there's a lot more to cover, but certainly when we look at this issue of functional illiteracy, moral illiteracy, cultural illiteracy, and biblical illiteracy, there are some very important things that we can learn and a great deal of work to do. So we'll look at some of the states of mind and some of the issues of lagging cultural IQ, the issue of low biblical literacy, some of the poor writing skills, maybe even get into the issue of over-medication, but then also get into some of the things having to do with some of the habits, short attention spans, narcissism, which I mentioned just a minute ago, and some of these obsessions, and then, of course, the consequences, because this does not bode well for a culture when indeed you have individuals who are not performing well. And so these are all part of this new book, and it is published by the Templeton Press. You can find out more by simply going to the website that we have linked it on our website today. Just click on the picture of Dr. Mark Bauerlein, and you will see stateoftheamericanmind.com. There's a place where you can find out a little bit more about some of this, even purchase a copy of the book. And for those of you that are parents or educators, I think it's just one of those books you really need to have on your bookshelf. As you go to the website today, you will see a couple of things. First of all, we encourage you to continue to pray for America. We have our Pray for America campaign, and you can sign up for that. The impact of the Supreme Court decision, some of which we'll be talking about in the second hour today when we get back to this issue of marriage and the definition of marriage. We have this video piece by Kelly Shackelford. He was also on Fox News Sunday yesterday, and of course joins us every Friday for our weekend edition as we talk about some of these religious liberty issues. That video is available, and we encourage you to watch it, and then maybe take the time to take that video and pass it on to some others. So lots of resources we have on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation about the state of the American mind right after this.
Are you ever frustrated with America's leaders? I know. Are you ever not frustrated? So, what are you doing about it? In Proverbs chapter 21, the Spirit of God hits us with this: the king's heart, and we could say the president's heart, the senator's heart, the congressman's heart, the Supreme Court justice's heart, is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. Your prayers unleash the most powerful weapon in the universe. If you're in union with Jesus Christ, your prayers touch God's heart. So again, what are you doing about your frustrations with government? Point of View Radio is spearheading a new effort to get as many as possible to pray for America. It starts when you visit our website, pointofview.net, and click on the Pray for America picture on the right side of the page. We'll send you our Pray for America booklet and updates on things to pray for. We must pray. Click in now to pointofview.net and pray for America. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation as we talk about the state of the American mind. Mark Bauerlein with us, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Mark, let's, if we can, talk about biblical literacy. And I love Daniel Dreisbach, who's been on the program with us before, because he says at the first presidential inauguration, George W. Bush delivered an address full of biblical language, including references to the Bible. And he says later media pundits were really kind of puzzled by it. A veteran CBS political commentator confessed there were a few phrases in the speech I didn't get. One was, when we see the wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, we will not pass to the other side. My goodness, the Good Samaritan, turn the other cheek. How could you be a literature student and read Shakespeare, Milton, or whatever without having an understanding of the Bible? So this level of biblical illiteracy is not only hurting our students, but it's making even some of our commentators unable to even make sense of the speeches they've heard.
Jericho, that's the Middle East, right? Wait a minute, I'm a New York Times reporter. I'm super worldly.
Yeah.
What do you say? Well, the problem here is not simply being ignorant of Christianity and of that episode that has been quoted maybe 1,489,000 times.
Yes.
This
is sad.
Loss of biblical literacy is particularly an issue in America, because, as Daniel brings out, how deeply a biblical understanding of themselves was ingrained in the early colonists up through the Revolution and really beyond, up until the mid-20th century. So that the most important framework for the Pilgrims and the Puritans was Exodus. It was a persecuted people leaving a tyrant, crossing the waters, and entering the wilderness and hoping for the promised land. These were the Pilgrims, to the point where they would refer, up through the 18th century, referred to the New World as our American Israel.
Yes.
Even the Jamestown colonists, who were there for commercial purposes, the first thing they did was erect a cross. So, having that understanding of the Sermon on the Mount, as well as the biblical stories of the Old Testament and the Jewish people, is simply part of our own history. If you don't know these things, then you are unaware of your American inheritance. And as part of being a citizen as well, this is one reason why they put religious liberty as the first right in the First Amendment. A lot of people don't realize it's the first one named in there. If you, Daniel also quotes another statistic. Some scholars went through political writings, pamphlets,
right,
and so on, published during the founding period.
Oh, yeah.
And the most commonly cited text was Deuteronomy, which is where you have the fullest expression of the Mosaic Law, of the Ten Commandments. So this is the Constitution doesn't talk about the Bible. It didn't have to. Everyone lived in a biblical understanding around that time. And so our effort in the last 60 years to expel the Bible from classrooms and from the public square is actually an enforced historical amnesia. We don't even talk about separation of church and state. We should talk about knowing who we are and where we've come from. King James is right at the center.
Incredible. You quoted from that research done by Donald Lutz, and one of my major professors at Georgetown was part of that as well. And I even quoted that yesterday in a Sunday school class, because when you go back through it, the Bible was quoted 34% of the time. It was quoted more than Locke, Montesquieu, anything. And then he went back and looked at those quotes. Again, a lot of them for Deuteronomy, but also other passages, Leviticus and Old and New Testament. Most of those quotes actually came from sermons given of that day. And if you don't know that, then a person can look at this or see a book like The Godless Constitution and say, well, no, the founders weren't Christian because they never mentioned Christianity, and they never really interacted on these issues, until you realize that a lot of the ideas that ended up in our Constitution actually started out from Bible verses given in sermons during the 18th century. And so you also get the historic revisionism that we get today, don't you?
Well, a lot of people writing at the Washington Post after Newt Gingrich this week said, had some commentary about myths about the founders and that the founders were all secularists. All these commenters wrote in saying that they didn't want to establish any religion. They wanted to keep government out of the religion business. And in other words, we've got this prevailing conception now of government and the public square being absolutely purified of any religious beliefs. And again, this is simply a distortion of the past. And I would say that this is part of a general project of secularization. Secularization has to change the American past, or it can't do what it does in the present, which is to say, eradicate religion. I think this is one reason why Justice Kennedy's final paragraph in his opinion on the same-sex marriage was able to fly. He says in there, no union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals. He says, and the petitioners here, their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. Well, Justice Kennedy, you're acting as if one of the oldest institutions of civilization is just kind of an empty vessel that the different couples can enter into, and as if the one man and one woman definition is somehow external to that institution, that same-sex couples have been excluded, and that marriage demands that they be included in it. In other words, he's invoking the traditional authority of marriage as one of civilization's foundations, and then, in the next sentence, he explodes it. He's taking traditional marriage and he's wrapping it up in all the high rhetoric, but then, in the very next sentence, he says, now we're going to change this civilization fundamental foundation. So only if you don't look closely and keep the history in mind is this sleight of hand able to happen. Now, the same thing is when Barack Obama turns the White House into an illuminated billboard for secular progressivism. Only if you forget the fact that the White House is not his.
Yes.
And the White House belongs to everyone, which makes every occupant of it have to be very careful not to use that edifice for political expression. I mean, this was a very divisive case. We'll just agree to that. There's a lot of strong feeling on both sides of the issue. President Obama, you can't use this civic base to make political points. You can't do this. Someone in the White House didn't tell him, you cannot do this. Was Valerie Jarrett's idea, but she has no civic understanding. The problem, the added problem here is people were deeply dismayed. A large portion of this country was quite demoralized by this decision. Doing that to the White House took them and rubbed their noses in the dirt. That's what you were doing. It's a form of gloating. It is triumphalism over, I would say, still more than half of the American people.
Wow. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into another aspect of that, because the success of same-sex marriage and a variety of other issues owes it to the chapter that Dennis Prager talks about. We live in the age of feelings. You know, we've had the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and he says maybe we should call this the age of feelings, and we want to talk about that briefly. Just one of the many chapters in the book, 16 different leading critics on the anti-intellectualism of our day. The book is entitled The State of the American Mind. It's published by Templeton Press. We have information about that and our guest on our Point of View website. We'll take a break, come back and talk about feelings right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Mark Bauerlein with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the state of the American mind. And one of the chapters in there, Mark, is Dennis Prager's. And he talks about this age of feelings. I began to notice that even when I was speaking on college campuses as a guest speaker, because students stopped saying, I think, but I feel. I feel that's wrong. But he said he began to notice that in the 1970s when he has used a very famous question he's used time and time again, asking high school students if they would save their dog or a stranger if both were drowning. And he says, with the exception of maybe a few religious schools, Jewish or Christian schools, almost always the results have been the same. About a third would save the dog, about a third would save the stranger, and a third just really found the question too difficult to answer. And when they tried to deal with it, there was no moral examination, no contrast between the difference between human beings created in the image of God and animals. Just really had mostly to do with a calculation of just how they felt about it.
When we have something that Philip Reef, way back in the early '60s, I think, called the triumph of the therapeutic, it said that we approach human behavior, human thoughts, attitudes. We approach them now not in moral terms, or certainly not in religious terms. We approach them in therapeutic terms. We ask them why they feel that way. We want to be analytical about things. The tendency in the 60s and 70s to try to understand criminality, to try to figure out what were the ingredients, how did this happen, and we hold off the judgment factor. And really, I would place this as a withdrawal of judgment, because it said, you feel a certain way, let's understand those feelings, and let's respect those feelings as yours, and we're never, ever going to say, that feeling you have is wrong. We just don't like to condemn people on those grounds. And Dennis Prager says, this is where we are now. And I get it when I talk on college campuses before, and I will talk about the dumbest generation. Students will get up and they'll say, well, I'm really offended by that title of yours.
You're hurting my feeling, yeah.
And I'll wait. Well, that's it? You're offended? For them, they have been taught that's enough. Mm-hmm. So you're not bringing anything else to the table here except your feelings of offense? Okay, you said you're offended. Next question. Come on. They have to be told we live in an open society. You have to be thin-skinned. You can't take offense at things so easily. And if you do take offense, you've got to translate that offense into a rational response. Your feelings are not that important. And this is another thing that I tell students. I don't care what you did over the weekend. I don't care how you feel about something. This is a college classroom. It's time to get beyond that. And believe me, if you think I'm unfeeling, wait until you have bosses in the workplace who are under pressure to get the work done. Unfortunately, mass culture, and we'll just say liberal values, teaches them their feelings are foremost. This is a terribly disabling condition to be in.
I would say so. We're just about out of time, and I wanted to not only talk about your book, but First Things. I have certainly been a beneficiary, and I would imagine some of our listeners have as well. So I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about what is certainly on this website that we are directing people to today, and that is the stateoftheamericanmind.com. But if you would also roll in some of the great resources that are available at First Things, because you have certainly taken on that mantle that began many years before you actually were the editor, and I wanted to encourage people to find out more about that as well.
Thank you. We've got firstthings.com is the website, and one of the things we want to do is to provide a forum for people to understand the dizzying events that are unfolding around us. We had a very strong forum the day after the same-sex marriage decision was, actually that night, I believe. We had the forum go up where we had 20 people, 18 or 20 people weighing in on what this decision means and where do we go from here. And so we want to give people many of whom feel besieged at this point, religious conservatives and social conservatives, we are in many places the bad guys. And we're the bad guys in places we didn't think we were going to be the bad guys. I think we're increasingly the bad guys in the Republican Party establishment. We are certainly the bad guys now in corporate America. Corporate America is no friend to religious and social conservatives. We're the bad guys, certainly in academia, sadly, even in many religious institutions. So first things is trying to maintain sound, intellectual, informed discussion that many people might find is emotionally satisfying as well as intellectually rigorous. It's nice to have an open conversation that isn't so geared against you all the time.
Sure. And you believe in cultural renewal, so that's certainly why you writing of these books on things like The Dumbest Generation or The State of the American Mind and Edit First Things. So since we've certainly talked about some of the problems, any quick comments before we let you go today on possible solutions? Yeah.
One thing I would tell your listeners is that it begins in the home, it begins with families, and that the home can overcome all of the decadence and deterioration that we see in culture, on TV, on the street, and in the political zones. What you can do, if you raise your kids with good reading, good intelligent conversation, good media surrounding them. There is great media on TV and on the radio and in newspapers still. You have them read books. You read the King James Bible I'm Catholic, so I'm saying this for cultural reasons, as part of being a citizen of this country. And you should be confident that you're doing a great thing for your children, and they are going to prosper when they go to college and when they go into the workplace. If you may feel like the cultural and political deck is stacked against you, but what you can do in the home can overcome all of that, and you will see your children. Your children will prosper even in this sordid world.
Might say to parents, too, choose your child's college wisely. Don't let them always choose it themselves. And a good antidote to that is the State of the American Mind. It'll help you understand what they might encounter and what you get to pay $200,000 for, and at the end have somebody that ends up not really having appreciation for the American culture, American exceptionalism, or even Christian values. So, Mark, I appreciate you joining us. I've been quoting you for many years, and it's a delight to have you on the program today.
Thank you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into that second topic, which we have sort of been alluding to, and that is the issue of marriage. And Dr. Denny Burk is with us, and we'll be talking about his book, but also just the decision that came down and what that means in terms of the redefinition of marriage and how that will affect you and your family. One thing that I do encourage you to do is go to our website today and find some of the resources. We have a place for you to sign up to Pray for America, and if you've not done that, certainly encourage you to do so. And why would you not, after all the decisions that have come down from the Supreme Court just in the last couple of weeks? My commentary today, Freedom to Advocate, gives you a little more in-depth analysis to the Supreme Court decision that came down a week ago Friday. And, of course, we have our Action Alert, which is one on the First Amendment Defense Act, which we believe is a very significant way to respond to what has taken place over these last 10 to 12 days. Let's take a break. When we come back, Dr. Denny Burk will be with us. We'll continue our conversation and get into the subject of marriage with him right after these important messages.
Life is busy. Can you identify? We run from one event to another. We even use reminders on our computer or phone to keep from missing appointments or forgetting something vital. But have you ever considered setting a reminder to pray for the nation, for this community? The great Christian reformer Martin Luther once said he had so much to do, he was going to get up even earlier the next day to spend 3 hours in prayer. Do you pray more when you know God is the only one who can enable you to get everything done, and when He's the only one who can get what's needed done? Okay, so there's no magic number of minutes or hours to pray, but if you're not spending time with God, if you're not praying for America, that's a problem. Let Point of View remind you to pray and things to pray for. Visit us at pointofview.net/pray. Get our free Pray for America booklet and wrist reminder. pointofview.net/pray. We'll send you reminders to pray for America. pointofview.net/pray. pointofview.net/pray. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about sex, marriage, and obviously tying that into the Supreme Court decision that came down a little over a week ago. Denny Burk is with us. He has his Ph.D. from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's professor of biblical studies at Boyce College, which is actually the undergraduate arm of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Also serves as an associate pastor at Kenwood Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. He also is the editor of the Journal of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, speaks and writes extensively about gender and sexuality. We have information about his blog and about him and the book that we'll be talking about as well, published by Crossway, What is the Meaning of Sex? Dr. Denny Burk, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, it is my pleasure, Kerby. Thank you.
It is great to chat with you. Of course, we've crossed paths as well, and certainly appreciate the good work that you've done. And before we get into the book, let's talk about that Journal for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. That has been a very important force to address many of these issues of gender and equality and marriage, and I know that you have really been on the forefront of that. So talk about that journal. It's a little more technical than some of the conversation we're going to have about your book, but I think for many people that want to understand some of these issues in a deeper way, that's a place to send them to. So talk about what's available there.
Yeah, and actually I finished up my editorship. I did 7 years with them and finished up late last year. So there's actually a new editor in place. But I just finished that up, but that's not widely known right now. But it is a fantastic work. But the Journal of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood is exactly what it sounds like. It's all about what do the Scriptures mean what do the Scriptures say about what it means to be a man and a woman. And in a big way, that's what's being contested right now in our culture. There used to be and there still is, an intramural debate among evangelicals about the role of women in ministry, the role of men and women and husbands and wives in the home. Those are still very much live debates, but the conversation has broadened now because of the way these things are contested in the culture in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender, and a lot of the theological groundwork and biblical groundwork was laid in these older conversations that CBMW and the Journal for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood that they presided over.
Well, again, it's just a great resource I want to point people to, and even though you're not the editor of that, I know your fingers certainly will still be involved in guiding it and providing direction and even writing some of the articles. But this book, which is one I wanted to let people know about, What is the Meaning of Sex? I love the way you break it down. 8 chapters: glorify God with your body, glorify God with your hermeneutic, glorify God with your marriage, glorify God with your conjugal union, glorify God with your family planning, glorify God with your gender, glorify God with your sexuality, glorify God with your singleness. We may not be able to cover all those chapters, but I think it's a very helpful way to think about this broad issue of sexuality. And Denny, before we get into the book per se, it does seem to me that the need for the book is even more important because there is so much gender confusion taking place right now. We hear about transgender. There is so much redefinition of marriage, as we could see from the Supreme Court decision. So this book was always important, but I think it's absolutely essential that we find ourselves now in this debate in the 21st century.
Oh, absolutely. And it's just, we're so fragmented in our thinking about these things. And many Christians grow up in contexts in which they in church contexts where they just don't hear anything about what the Bible has to say or what the Christian faith has to say about gender and sexuality. And what a lot of people, unfortunately, believe is that there is no word because they haven't heard a word. They think that there is no word. But actually the opposite is true. The Christian faith and the Christian tradition is a deep well of resources that teach us about how we're supposed to think about what it means to be male and female, what it means to be embodied individuals, what it means to be sexual individuals. So what I'm trying to do in this book is try to explain what the Scriptures teach.
Sure.
So I'm not trying to account for all of church history, but I'm mainly trying to get us back to the norm that's not normed by any other norm and try to figure out what is the biblical worldview on these things and to try to speak that into a fresh contemporary context.
Well, there's a couple of issues. First of all, this idea of glorify God that goes through all 5 of your chapters, and that really goes back to 1 Corinthians 10, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. It doesn't say when you sometimes do a few things, glorify God, but it is basically this idea that whatever you do all to the glory of God. And so people sometimes put their work, maybe in this case their sexuality, maybe the way they handle their finances in a different category than what they do in their home or what they do in their church. And you reject that idea, don't you?
Well, yeah, and for a lot of folks, there's some words that we use in church that we use them so often that we forget that we don't even know what they mean. And the word glory and this idea of glorifying God is kind of one of them. It can be sort of an exclamation that we make without thinking through what exactly does this mean, glorify God in everything. And what I'm trying to do is to apply this to the issue of sexuality, not because no one's ever done this before, but because Paul not only says what he says in 1 Corinthians 10, but because he says that he applies the idea specifically to the issue of sexuality in 1 Corinthians 6. And so many of your listeners may remember 1 Corinthians 6, Paul is writing to a group of believers in Corinth, some of the men, were visiting prostitutes. And they were justifying this bad behavior by saying that we're no longer under the law. All things are lawful for me. And Paul says, well, actually, that's not the case. All things aren't lawful for you. Not all things are profitable. Not all things edify. And so he's kind of having this conversation in 1 Corinthians 6 with these men who are wanting to commit immorality. And Paul ends up telling them, glorify God with your body. And what he meant by that was glorify God with your body when you use it for sexual purposes. Now, I grew up Baptist, and we always heard that verse quoted in terms of, you shouldn't smoke or drink.
Yes.
Glorify God with your body. Now, whatever you think about those issues is fine, but it's kind of separate from this text. This text is specifically focusing on the use of the body for sex. And Paul says, when you use your body for sexual purposes, it's for God's glory. And a lot of people don't think about sexuality in that way. But that is the fundamental meaning of our lives as sexual beings, that God intends everything, including our sexual lives, to glorify Him. And so what I'm trying to do is say, well, how do you do that? What does glorifying God with my body look like when it comes to sexuality? And so that's what unfolds in the pages of this book.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some other aspects of that. We'll talk about glorify God with your hermeneutic, how you interpret the Bible. And he says that's like a cage match. So we'll get into that discussion and help us understand how some people have misinterpreted some of these verses, maybe either accidentally or I think in many cases intentionally. And I think this will be very helpful. And again, we're providing you with all sorts of tools for your evangelistic and apologetic toolbox. That's why we have Dr. Denny Burk with us today. We'll continue our conversation with him and a little bit later with you right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Words have meaning, sometimes especially in a landmark court case dealing with the legalization of same-sex marriage. Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for the majority of the Supreme Court, acknowledged that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that by divine precepts, same-sex marriage should be condoned. In his opinion, he pointed to the First Amendment that ensures that religious organizations and persons be given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths. But the opinion rarely talks about the free exercise of religion or even the establishment of a state religion. In his dissent, Justice Clarence Thomas seemed disturbed by the way Justice Kennedy framed the issues. He said the majority appears unmoved by that inevitability. It makes only a weak gesture towards religious liberty in a single paragraph. He goes on to say that even that gesture indicates a misunderstanding of religious liberty in our nation's tradition. Religious liberty is about more than just the protection for religious organizations and persons as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faith. Justice John Roberts focused on the words that were used and the word that wasn't. He says the majority graciously suggested that religious believers may continue to advocate and teach their views of marriage. The First Amendment guarantees, however, the freedom to exercise religion. Ominously, that is not the word that the majority uses. I believe the way Justice Kennedy framed this majority opinion should be a concern. One guest on my radio program suggested this section of the opinion might be just poorly worded. That may be true, but I doubt it. This majority opinion seems to be saying that you can advocate for traditional marriage, but you can't exercise your religion based upon that belief. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Denny Burk, and again, he is at a very important university, Boyce College, which is an undergraduate arm of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. You might want to find out a little bit more about some of these colleges, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Author of the book, What is the Meaning of Sex? And Dr. Denny Burk, I thought we might talk about glorify God with your hermeneutic. This will be a very helpful chapter because right now we're getting all sorts of people coming up with all sorts of different interpretations to make them feel good about the recent decision on same-sex marriage. And you talk about this idea of a cage match hermeneutic. Anybody that's not familiar with cage matches, that's where you put two contestants in there, and a wrestler basically has to either win or lose, has to either be successful or be defeated because you're trapped in the ring for better or worse. Tell me how that applies to this idea of interpreting Scripture.
Well, there's a lot of folks who wish to justify all manner of sexual aberrations, including homosexual aberrations, by appealing to Scripture. And you for a lot of people, you wouldn't think that you would appeal to Scripture to justify sexual immorality, much less homosexuality. But a lot of people do, and what they do is they say, look, if you look at all of Jesus' words, you'll never see him talk about homosexuality. And so, because Jesus never talks about it, if you want to be a red-letter Christian, there's a group called the Red Letter Christian, and you just want to focus on the words of Jesus and the things he says, maybe in particular in the Sermon on the Mount, and that'll be your central defining ethic that governs the rest of your reading of Scripture. So that because Jesus doesn't really address this issue, therefore it sort of marginalizes or kind of muffles out the other places in Scripture where it is mentioned. So what you end up with is Jesus in a cage match with Paul, because Paul so clearly talks about these things, talks about issues of sexuality, and Jesus doesn't, or so it's claimed. And so it looks to people like you're setting these two guys up, and because Jesus always wins, Jesus vanquishes Paul, and therefore what Paul says about his condemnations of homosexuality don't have to figure into our moral equation. And so what I'm saying is that cage match is unbiblical, and it's a way of reading the Bible that doesn't glorify God.
Yes.
And if you're gonna read the Scriptures correctly, you have to do it in the way that the authors intend, and you have to do it in a way that recognizes the full authority and inspiration of the Scripture, because that kind of an approach at the end of the day ends up you end up saying that the gospel writers who record Jesus' words were wrong or were right, and Paul was wrong. So the way to really think about this from a Christian perspective is just to remember Jesus actually does address this issue in his various sayings about sexual immorality. I think homosexual immorality is included in that. Jesus also says in the Sermon on the Mount, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, meaning that I didn't come to revise the sexual norms of the Old Testament. And you see that borne out over the rest of the New Testament. It's just what the Old Testament teaches on sexuality is actually brought forward into the New. As far as, and then when it comes to same-sex relationships, Jesus does in fact define marriage in Matthew 19, where the question that was before him was on divorce, but he says, have you not read from the very beginning, God created them male and female, the two shall become one flesh. He defines marriage, which is the only context which is legitimate for sexual expression. He defines it as a male-female union. So it's actually kind of a superficial reading in the first place to say that Jesus never addresses it. And then just one more thing, in terms of why is it not mentioned in the explicit way that Paul mentions it? Well, the issue is because Jesus never left very far from home. He never traveled that far away. Paul had a mission to the Gentiles where homosexuality was a live option and people were engaged in it all the time. And so you see Paul confronting it in a way that was contextually sensitive that Jesus didn't have to face because he never left Palestine.
All very good. And again, that helps people answer that question, because if you grew up like I did around gay pride weeks, you would see in the San Francisco Bay Area individuals carrying a sign, what Jesus said about homosexuality, and the rest of the sign is blank. Or if you go to a Facebook page, you'll see this today, what Jesus said about homosexuality, and then just a lot of white space. And so this, I think, is a very helpful answer to that. It's not a cage match. And frankly, I've always said to my homosexual contacts, okay, let's just keep that argument going for just a second. I mean, I don't agree with you, but we'll keep it going for just a second. Jesus didn't say much about incest, bestiality, rape, all sorts of things. So are you going to, and I don't want to push that too far, because where our culture is going, maybe some people say, yeah, that's a good idea too. But nevertheless, I think you have some pretty good answers. Your other chapter on glorify God with your marriage. This, I think, Denny Burk, would be very helpful for people to understand that this is a redefinition of marriage. I've seen some of the posts and Twitter feeds and Facebook posts and everything saying, well, we're not really redefining marriage, we're expanding it. But, you have a section in here about how the Bible defines marriage, how Paul and Jesus both explain what marriage is. And once you understand that, you recognize that, again, you glorify God through your marriage, both how you act in it and how you define it.
Well, that's right. It's really fascinating when you read the Scripture, especially in the New Testament. Probably the two most important voices on marriage in the New Testament are Jesus's and Paul's. And in both of their cases, both Jesus and Paul, when they want to talk about what the deepest, the innermost meaning of marriage is, they never go back to the polygamous kings of Israel, David or Solomon, to define and to explain what marriage is. They never go back to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, the polygamous patriarchs, to say, look, this is the norm for marriage. Without exception, Jesus and Paul always go back to the pre-fall monogamous union of Adam and Eve. And they quote Genesis 2:24, where it says, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And they look at that union, which was a monogamous, heterosexual union of one man and one woman, in covenant. They look at that and they say that is what the norm of marriage is. Before there was any sin in the world, there was a marriage. It was a pre-political institution, and it was defined this way, and which is significant because what we find out in the New Testament from Paul is that original union, Adam and Eve's union, and every other marriage since exists not for its own sake, not to fulfill any emotional or psychological need on the part of the persons that are getting married. The ultimate reason for marriage, every marriage, any marriage, is to glorify God, because marriage is a picture, it's an icon of the gospel. And so Paul says in Ephesians 5 that marriage represents, he says, this mystery of marriage is great, and I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. And so marriage is supposed to be a depiction of the way that Christ, the husband, loves his bride, the church, and the way that the husband lays his life down sacrificially for his bride, and the way that the bride follows the leadership of her husband. This is all an icon of gospel realities. And so marriage is, the gospel isn't just an illustration of marriage so we can get our marriages better. It's the other way around. Our marriages are supposed to be an illustration of a much deeper truth. And this is why for Christians, we can't accept a redefinition of marriage.
Yes.
Because to redefine marriage is to redefine those gospel mysteries that the Bible says we cannot touch. And so that is why these things are so precious to us and why they're so important to us, because it's pointing to what the Scripture says about the gospel.
Going to take a break. When we come back, though, I want to spend just another minute or two on that chapter on Glorify God with Your Marriage, because there's a very helpful table that comes from Gordon Wenham about the 12 different prohibitions to marriage in the Old Testament, which most of those have been carried out into our law as well, because it was based on a Judeo-Christian idea. And it illustrates again that when people say, I should be free to marry anybody, well, no, we have limits on whether or not you can marry your mother, your cousin, and a variety of other things. And a lot of those are found in the New Testament. And just again, an illustration of some of the material that probably should have been considered by at least 5 Supreme Court justices, but we're taking our time to go through it, looking at it from a biblical point of view. But if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us a little bit longer Dr. Denny Burk. The book is entitled, What is the Meaning of Sex? It is published by Crossway Books. We have information on our website, and we'll be back right after this.
Are you ever frustrated with America's leaders? I know. Are you ever not frustrated? So, what are you doing about it? In Proverbs chapter 21, the Spirit of God hits us with this: the king's heart, and we could say the president's heart, the senator's heart, the congressman's heart, the Supreme Court justice's heart, is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. Your prayers unleash the most powerful weapon in the universe. If you're in union with Jesus Christ, your prayers touch God's heart. So again, what are you doing about your frustrations with government? Point of View Radio is spearheading a new effort to get as many as possible to pray for America. It starts when you visit our website, pointofview.net, and click on the Pray for America picture on the right side of the page. We'll send you our Pray for America booklet and updates on things to pray for. We must pray. Click in now to pointofview.net and pray for America. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Dr. Denny Burk with us as we talk about his book, What is the Meaning of Sex? It's published by Crossway Books. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a place for you to order it if you would like to do so. Let me, if I can, just real quickly, maybe have you talk about some of the prohibitions to marriage. And then I thought we'd take a phone call that I think will get us right into your chapter on glorify God with your sexuality. But there are lots of helpful things in your book, Denny, but one of those is this chart that Gordon Wenham put together, which just shows that, this idea that, well, I can marry anybody. And the Old Testament law code in particular, when you go back to things like Leviticus and other passages, you couldn't marry your mother, you couldn't marry your aunt, your stepmother. I mean, there were a lot of limitations. And those limitations many times exist to this very day in our state laws for genetic reasons, for moral reasons. And so as a result, this idea that, well, any two people in love, no matter, and of course, why stop at two? Any group of people that say they love each other could get married. That shows the incredible danger when you say there should be no limits on who can marry another person or other persons, if we want to be inclusive, as the debate seems to be going. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's true. And even the people who say that they support so-called marriage equality, if you press them on it, they don't really hold to marriage equality if you're defining equality as the right to marry whoever you want or whoever you love. Because what you'll find when you look around in the world is that people love all different kinds of sexual relationships, and they get into relationships that are, well, basically define norms that all of us would agree to. The one that frequently comes up is the norm of monogamy. And, the Scripture teaches, I have a section on this in my book, the Scripture teaches a monogamous norm. Even in the Old Testament, it teaches that. That happens to be a norm that our culture agrees to, that monogamy is correct. And so, but the thing is, if you redefine what marriage is, and if you redefine that it should be of the opposite sex, well, all the other norms are up in the air too. So why should the monogamous norm not be up in the air? Why should the incestuous norm? We think that incest is wrong. Why shouldn't that be up in the air? Once you start redefining things, it's a very slippery slope.
Sure. I
know people don't like slippery slope arguments, but the slope is in fact slippery on this one. And we're already seeing erosion in some of those other areas.
Well, again, I don't even use that phrase because some people react to it and just simply say, look, every argument for same-sex marriage is pretty much also a very compelling argument for polygamy, polyamory, all sorts of other issues. So that is certainly the case. But let me take a phone call because I think it'll really kind of set up Chapter 7 in your book, Glorify God with Your Sexuality. So Jennifer in North Carolina, please tell us your story if you might.
Yeah, I understand that the wrongness of the Supreme Court's decision to validate same-sex marriages nationwide. But my problem is I have loved ones that are homosexual, and I'm concerned with how to deal with it should they decide they found the love of their lives and they come to me. How do I reject the lifestyle and yet show the love of God at the same time? I mean, for the life of me, I can't imagine allowing the couple in their home to celebrate, but I can't imagine turning them away either.
Denny, let me come to you for just a little bit. I mean, obviously, we've tried to cover some of this with Sean McDowell and John Stonestreet's book. I think you kind of address this as well because we have to recognize that there is a difference between homosexual orientation and homosexual behavior. We have to understand that sometimes there are, because of this fallenness, our sexuality is fallen too. So we have to understand that intellectually. But of course, Jennifer's saying, how do I also address this emotionally? Can you give us some biblical guidelines, perhaps?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the fact is that most of your listeners listening are going to have friends, family members, neighbors that they know and that they care about that are gay, and that struggle with same-sex attraction, or perhaps don't struggle with it because they're completely fine with it. It's just a fact of life that we live and love and know people who disagree with the Christian view on these things. And what I would just want to say I'm a pastor as well, and what I want to say to my congregation is, listen, we need these people in our lives. We want to be their friends. We want to get to know them, and we want to practice hospitality with them. We want to have an opportunity to be a part of their lives, to speak in their lives, to learn from them. And you can't do that by cloistering off and separating yourself from them. Listen, one thing I would say to folks who have maybe a gay family member, maybe a parent who's dealing with a child who is gay, don't kick your child out of your house, okay? In a former generation, some pretty egregious things happened. Don't do that. You need to figure out a way to speak the truth in love and to engage those people with the gospel. And so Christians, we're not going to let the culture outgrace us. And we're not going to treat the truth as if it's somehow at odds with love, because they're not. It is possible for us to bear witness to Jesus, to bear witness to the truth, and also to offer the grace of Jesus and the love and the mercy of Christ as well. So, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13 that love always rejoices with the truth. And so we're going to have to love into some hard places, but that's exactly what the gospel equips us for. And it doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have occasion to cry some tears, because you are. But it does mean that you need to hang in there and have the confidence of your convictions, and that God is going to use you into whatever place He calls you.
I think motivation is another factor in that, because let's take it out of the issue of homosexuality, because that's so supercharged right now. But let's think about if you have a college-age daughter that comes home and her boyfriend wants to come home and stay in the same room. I'm thinking most parents are going to say, no, I don't think we're going to do that, because I got a feeling that even if you were in separate beds, I don't think you'll stay there. And so that's one issue. Let's take another one. If you had a child come home and pretty soon you could smell marijuana because they're smoking marijuana, and let's assume you're in a state where that's not legal, you wouldn't allow those kinds of things to happen. So there is a sense in which when you maybe back away from the issue of homosexuality a little bit and ask yourself, what would be the rules in my home, and what kind of rules would I implement if it were other issues? I think that at least gives you some guidance there as well. But to, as you said, completely reject individuals, there are different motivations. And I appreciate you saying that, because there's a fundamentally different kind of attitude I'm going to have towards somebody who has same-sex attraction but is struggling with it than I'm going to have with somebody, as you just pointed out. And I'm so glad you did that, because I so get tired of this struggling with it. I met a lot of homosexuals aren't struggling with it at all, and they're in your face with it. And so I think there is a lot to be said about using wisdom, discernment with biblical principles, and the circumstances might be a little different given the attitude of your family member, given what they may or may not want to do in your home. And those are all important parts of determining how you react, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And, not every situation is the same. If I've got a friend at work who is struggling with same-sex attraction or not struggling with it, they're just giving over to it, I'm trying to find ways to be a part of their life and to speak the gospel into their life. And so it's a confident leaning forward into their life to try to shed light into their life. If I'm speaking to someone who is calling themselves a Christian and is setting themselves before God's people as a Christian teacher and saying that it's okay to live a homosexual lifestyle, and a lot of those teachers are around today, you're going to see a lot of confrontation coming out of me at that moment.
And
in fact, I spend a lot of time doing that in apologetic kinds of settings. and you're going to hear rebukes coming from me. So it really depends on what the situation is and what the person is contemplating. And so that's why I'm trying to say that truth and love aren't inimical to one another, but it does cause us to have to be wise to know what word to speak in a given situation.
Let's take a break. When we come back, I will spend just a moment on glorify God with your gender. God made them male and female. There are different roles, different statuses, and most importantly, this issue of individuals that want to change their gender, whether we're doing more harm than good. Those are just a few topics that we'll try to address real quickly out of that chapter. And we won't, of course, cover all of it, but again, that's why you might want to get a copy of the book, What is the Meaning of Sex? By Dr. Denny Burk. We'll be back with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Denny Burk with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. One of your chapters is Glorify God with Your Gender, and of course, a lot of that focus was on the biblical manhood topics and all of the rest. But with gender, things have changed dramatically. And again, I appreciate the thoroughness of your chapter, because you do point out that we do have certain syndromes, Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, and others, where you may have some kind of let's be careful here. Sexual ambiguity might be a good word. But first of all, one of the things you learn very quickly in an ethics class, Dr. Denny Burk, is bad cases make bad ethics, or in law school, bad cases make bad law. So you don't take the exceptions to do the rule. But we are in a world where people think that gender is not given by God, that there aren't just two genders, but there are multiple genders, and that people can change their genders. All of that really contradicts the biblical admonition, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And here, again, is an issue that Jesus himself directly spoke to in Matthew 19, where he affirmed the fact that God, in the Garden of Eden, when everything was still good, created a male and a female. He created a man and a woman, and he, called them together in the covenant of marriage. But there was a basic binary in the human race that God created and declared to be good. And so, what that means is that the rest of Scripture unfolds the goodness of that binary. That there's a difference between male and female, and there are different roles and expectations that attach to that biblically, and that we're called to embrace those things. But that's the thing that's being muddled today and is being called into question. So that if you treat gender as kind of some kind of a binary that is indicated by your biology, you're some kind of a throwback to a formal patriarchal era. But that's really not what the Scriptures teach. The Scriptures teach that God created male and female, and that it was good. And probably the main, one of the main challenges we're seeing today is the transgender challenge to that norm, and that people are saying, look, if you teach the old way of thinking about these things, that God intends for every person to be either male or female, then you're being abusive and harmful to people. The biblical witness is actually telling us something that goes directly contrary to that.
Let's take another phone call. We'll go out to California. Chris, listening on KYCC, what would you like to add to the conversation?
I was just going to say, I posted, when the ruling came out, I posted 2 Bible verses on Facebook, and I didn't say anything but just the verses, and they're ones about, sin. And, it mentioned, homosexuality in those verses. And I got tons of backlash on it from, my wife's relatives. And, my response to them was, hey, where's your tolerance? You want me to be tolerant? What about your tolerance on my beliefs? It seems like it's one-sided. It's like, I'm supposed to be tolerant if it's something I don't like, but you can't do vice versa. And I also wanted to comment that I saw an article that, it's like, where do we draw the line? There's actually people that are going to, that have done studies that are now saying people are born with, pedophiles. It's like, where's it going to end? It's kind of my question. And also, one last thing is that, everybody's putting these rainbow things in front of their pictures on their Facebook profile picture. Mm-hmm. And a Christian guy said, well, there's not an app for us that oppose it. So he suggested that people post their wedding photo, which I did that, and it was funny because I got a bunch of likes on it, but from people that had the rainbow thing, and they kind of didn't get why I put that there. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I thought that was a great idea.
I think so. First one on tolerance. I mean, here, sometimes, let's face it, Denny, we Christians can be offensive. But assuming this is the way Chris did it, it's the offense of the cross. I mean, there is, if you haven't done any commentary, haven't said anything derogatory, and you just put, for some people, just the Bible alone is offensive. And that's the world that we find ourselves in right now, isn't it?
Yeah, and we shouldn't be surprised that the world is going to chafe at our message sometimes. Jesus said, the servant's not greater than his master. If they hated me, they're going to hate you too. And the reason they're going to hate you is because you're attached to me. So if we're faithful to Jesus and we're faithful proclaimers of his word, that's going to sometimes bring a confrontation with the world. Now, we don't get any, brownie points or pats on the back for being obnoxious or being jerks. It shouldn't be that. But when we're just speaking the truth in love and there's blowback from the culture or from people that we know in our lives, shouldn't be a surprise to us that Jesus prepared us for that.
Let's just, before I let you go, talk about what people can learn by maybe tying into some of the resources. And, of course, we've talked about the Journal of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and, of course, what is the meaning of sex. But, of course, you're also a professor at Boyce College. And, of course, we've also talked about Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So if we have someone that's thinking about going off to college, or maybe somebody's graduated from college and thinking about the ministry, talk about some of the options that exist right there in Knoxville.
Yeah, we're in Louisville, Kentucky.
Louisville, excuse me. Yeah, misspoke.
Yeah. We're in Louisville, Kentucky, and I got to tell you, I love this school. Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is a school that believes the Scripture, and more than anything, if you're thinking about ministry, if you're thinking about pastoral ministry, you need to have a Christian worldview, and you need to be able to handle the Scripture. And going forward, as our culture is sort of darkening on all of these issues, the church is going to have to retrench and reform, and we're going to have to do that around the Scripture. And cultural Christianity is going away, and so what we're trying to do is to prepare God-called ministers to meet that challenge, to teach people to love the Bible and to hang true to the gospel no matter what. So if any of your listeners are looking for that kind of an experience, we're that kind of a school.
Yeah, Boyce College on Lexington Road on Louisville, Kentucky. I misspoke before. And one of the cut lines is, we're serious about the gospel, and I know that you are. And if you're interested in seminary education, certainly a lot of the Southern Baptist seminaries around the country, including the one Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, are great places to check out and find out a little bit more. Denny Burk, you've done a great job. This is a very good book. I appreciate the work that you've done over the years as the editor of the Journal of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Appreciate the work that you're doing there now at Boyce College, and thank you for writing this book, What is the Meaning of Sex? Let's do it again sometime.
You bet. Thank you, Kerby, for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
We're going to take a break, but just before we do so, we've given you all sorts of great resources here. If you wanted to know how to maybe respond to the Supreme Court decision on marriage, we have Kelly Shackelford's video, and my assignment to you is to watch it and maybe then click the share button, put it maybe on your Facebook page, and that's a way that you can find some more information. If you haven't already joined with us, we still are convinced that one of the best pieces of legislation so far is this First Amendment Defense Act. And this is something that I think would provide protection to your church, to your pastor, to your Christian school. And so we have already encouraged you to take action on that. And if you have not done so, that's on the website. And of course, my Viewpoints commentary today on one more aspect of that Supreme Court decision that caused us some concern. So I hope you'll find some of that material. It's all available on our website, pointofview.net. And we do want to thank those of you that have supported us financially. And if you have never done so before, you might click on that button that says donate and help us out as well. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris and Abby for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Life is busy. Can you identify? We run from one event to another. We even use reminders on our computer or phone to keep from missing appointments or forgetting something vital. But have you ever considered setting a reminder to pray for the nation, for this community? The great Christian reformer Martin Luther once said he had so much to do, he was going to get up even earlier the next day to spend 3 hours in prayer. Do you pray more when you know God is the only one who can enable you to get everything done, and when He's the only one who can get what's needed done? Okay, so there's no magic number of minutes or hours to pray, but if you're not spending time with God, if you're not praying for America, that's a problem. Let Point of View remind you to pray and things to pray for. Visit us at pointofview.net/pray. Get our free Pray for America booklet and wrist reminder. Pointofview.net/pray. We'll send you reminders to pray for America. Pointofview.net/pray. Pointofview.net/pray. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.